The fluorescent lights of the Walmart Supercenter in Independence, Missouri, hummed overhead as Travis Kelce pushed his shopping cart through the aisles. It was 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the NFL superstar was trying to accomplish something that had become increasingly difficult since his relationship with Taylor Swift went public. Shop for groceries like a normal person. He'd chosen this particular Walmart specifically because it was in a quieter suburb outside Kansas City, where he was less likely to be recognized. Travis pulled his Chiefs baseball cap low over his eyes and kept his head down as he navigated through the produce section, tossing bananas and apples into his cart. The routine shopping trip was going smoothly until he reached the checkout lane. As he approached the self-checkout area, something made him pause. There, at Register 7, stood a woman whose face stopped him cold. Mrs. Marjorie Halberton. Travis blinked hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, there she was, his 10th grade history teacher from Cleveland Heights High School, wearing a blue Walmart vest and methodically scanning items for a customer. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn 15 years ago. But everything else about her seemed different, smaller, more fragile. Tired in a way that went deeper than just the end of a long workday. Travis stood frozen in the aisle, his mind racing back to room 237 at Cleveland Heights High. Mrs. Halberton had been the teacher who'd seen something in him beyond football. While other educators focused solely on his athletic potential, she'd pushed him academic, making him rewrite essays until they met her standard, staying after school to help him understand the complexity of American history. "Mr. Kelce," she'd say, with that slight smile of hers, "your mind is just as powerful as your body. Don't waste either one." She'd been the first person to tell him he was smart enough for college. Really smart, not just football smart. When Travis had struggled with the idea of balancing academics and athletic, Mrs. Halberton had sat him down and explained that true success meant excelling in the classroom first, the football field second. Now, watching her bag groceries for strangers, Travis felt something twist in his chest. He abandoned his cart and walked over to her register, getting in line behind an elderly man buying cat food and TV dinner. When it was his turn to step forward, Mrs. Halberton looked up with her standard customer service smile. "Good evening. Did you find everything you—" Her words died mid-sentence as recognition dawned in her eyes. "Travis? Travis Kelce? Hi." He said softly, using the nickname all her students had called her. "How are you?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. Other customers in nearby lines began to notice, phones discreetly appearing as people realized they were witnessing something unusual. But Travis only had eyes for his former teacher. I'm fine, sweetheart," Mrs. Halberton said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Look at you. I've been following your career, you know. So proud of what you've accomplished." "What are you doing here?" Travis asked gently, though he immediately regretted the bluntness of the question. Mrs. Halberton's professional smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, you know how it is. Retirement wasn't quite what we'd planned for." She gestured vaguely at her vest. "This keeps me busy." Travis noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for his item. This wasn't a woman working for pin money or social interaction. This was a woman who needed this job. "Mrs. H, can we talk? After your shift? Maybe grab some coffee?" She glanced around nervously, aware that other customers were watching and that her manager, a stern-looking man in his 30s, was observing from across the store. "I don't get off until 10 p.m., she said quietly, "and I'm sure you have more important things." "Nothing's more important than this," Travis interrupted. "Nothing. I'll wait." The conviction in his voice seemed to surprise her. She nodded slowly. "There's a Denny's about 2 miles down Highway 40. I'll meet you there at 10:15. I'll be there." Travis paid for his item, milk, bread, and cereal that he didn't really need, and left the store. But instead of going home, he sat in his truck in the parking lot, calling his assistant to clear his schedule for the next morning. Something was wrong, very wrong. Mrs. Halberton shouldn't be working at a Walmart at age 67. She'd been a dedicated teacher for over 30 years, had earned her master's degree, had always talked about the travel she and her husband wanted to do in retirement. At 10:05 p.m., Travis watched Mrs. Halberton emerge from the store's employee entrance, looking exhausted. She'd changed out of her Walmart vest into a worn cardigan and was walking slowly toward an old Honda Civic that had seen better days. Travis followed her to the Denny, his mind already working through possibility. He didn't know what had happened to bring his former teacher to this point, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her struggle alone. The restaurant was nearly empty when Mrs. Halberton slid into the booth across from him. Up close, under the harsh diner lighting, she looked even more worn than she had in the store. "You really didn't have to do this, Travis," she said, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee. "I'm sure you have better things to do with your time. Mrs. H., you changed my life. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. So no, there's nothing better I could be doing right now." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all evening. "You always were one of my favorites, you know. Not just because you were talented, but because you cared. You asked questions. You wanted to understand, not just memorize." "What happened?" Travis asked gently. "Last I heard, you were retiring. You and Mr. Halberton were going to travel, see Europe." Mrs. Halberton's face crumpled slightly. "Gerald had a stroke 8 months ago, a massive one. He's in a long-term care facility now. The medical bills, the care costs." She trailed off, staring into her coffee. "Insurance didn't cover it?" "Some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. We lost our saving, had to refinance the house twice. I came out of retirement 4 months ago because we needed the income and the health benefits." Travis felt anger building in his chest, not at Mrs. Halberton, but at a system that could let this happen to someone who had dedicated her life to educating young people. "How much?" he asked quietly. "I'm sorry. How much do you owe? For the medical bills, the care facility, all of it?" Mrs. Halberton looked uncomfortable. "Travis, I didn't tell you this so you would—" "How much?" She was quiet for a long moment. "About $180,000. "But Travis, I can't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it." "No." Her voice was firm, carrying the same authority it had when she'd commanded a classroom full of teenagers. "I won't take charity. Not even from you." Travis leaned forward. "Mrs. H., you remember what you used to tell us about paying it forward? About how kindness creates ripples?" She nodded slowly. "You created ripples that are still spreading. Every paper you made me rewrite, every time you stayed late to help me understand something, every moment you believed in me, those ripples led to everything I've accomplished. This isn't charity. This is me paying it forward." Mrs. Halberton's eyes filled with tears. "Travis, let me help, please. You gave me the tools to build the life I have now. Let me use that life to help you." Outside the Denny's windows, the Kansas City suburbs stretched into darkness. Inside the nearly empty restaurant, a former NFL superstar and his high school history teacher sat across from each other, connected by 15 years and the immeasurable impact of a teacher who had seen potential in a young man and refused to let him waste. By the time they left the diner at midnight, Travis had a plan. It would take more than just writing a check. Mrs. Halberton's pride wouldn't allow that, but he was going to find a way to help her, even if it meant getting creative. The next morning, Travis would make some phone calls that would change everything. But neither he nor Mrs. Halberton could have predicted how quickly a simple act of kindness would spiral into something much larger and much more complicated. Travis spent most of Wednesday morning pacing his home office, his phone buzzing with ignored calls from reporters and his agent. Word had somehow leaked that he'd been spotted at a suburban Walmart, and the speculation was running wild. But Travis had bigger concerns than tabloid gossip. He'd been awake since 5 a.m., researching elder care costs, medical debt relief programs, and trying to figure out the best way to help Mrs. Halberton without wounding her pride. Direct payment was out. She'd made that clear. But there had to be another way. The answer came to him during his third cup of coffee: a scholarship fund. Travis called his financial advisor first, then his lawyer, and finally his publicist. By noon, he had the framework for something that could help not just Mrs. Halberton, but other retired teachers facing similar struggle. The Marjorie Halberton Educational Excellence Fund, he said into the phone to his publicist, Rachel Martinez. "We'll set it up as a legitimate nonprofit that provides financial assistance to retired educators facing medical hardship." "Travis, that's beautiful," Rachel said. "But are you sure you want to use her real name? She might not appreciate being thrust into the spotlight." Travis paused. He hadn't considered that. Mrs. Halberton was a private person who'd spent her career focused on her student, not seeking attention for herself. You're right, let's call it the Teacher's Legacy Support Fund. But Mrs. H will be the first recipient, and she'll help us identify others who need assistance. How much are we talking about for the initial funding? $500,000 to start. But Rachel, here's the important part. We're not announcing this as a Travis Kelce charity. We're presenting it as a community initiative that I'm supporting. I want the focus to be on the teacher, not on me. After hanging up with Rachel, Travis drove back to the Walmart where Mrs. Halberton worked. He'd called ahead and learned she was scheduled for the 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift. He waited in the parking lot until her lunch break, then sent a text asking if she could spare a few minutes. They met at a small coffee shop next to a Dollar Tree, where Mrs. Halberton looked anxious and kept checking her watch. "I only have 20 minutes, she said. "And Travis, if this is about last night, it is, but not the way you think." Travis pulled out a folder he'd prepared. "I want to run something by you. What if there was a way to help you that didn't feel like charity?" Mrs. Halberton raised an eyebrow, her teacher instincts kicking in. "I'm listening." Travis explained his idea for the Teacher's Legacy Support Fund. As he talked, he watched her expression change from skepticism to interest to something that might have been hope. "You'd be helping us identify other teachers who need assistance," he concluded. "It would be a job, essentially. Paid consultant work evaluating applications and helping us understand the real challenges retired educators face. And the medical bills would be handled as part of the fund's mission. You wouldn't be receiving charity. You'd be receiving support from an organization dedicated to honoring the contribution of teachers like you." Mrs. Halberton was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "How many other teachers are you planning to help?" "As many as we can, but I need someone who understands the education system to help us do it right. Someone who knows what teachers really need, not what outsiders think they need." "And you want me to quit Walmart?" "Only if you want to. If you'd rather keep working there and do this on the side, that's fine too. This is about giving you choices, not taking them away." Mrs. Halberton looked at him with the same appraising gaze she'd used when evaluating his essays. "You've really thought this through, haven't you? I learned from the best. You always told us to think 3 steps ahead." That afternoon, while Mrs. Halberton finished her shift, Travis worked with his team to formalize the fund. By 6 p.m., they had the legal paperwork filed and a basic website created. By 8 p.m., they had identified 12 retired teachers in the Kansas City area who were facing medical debt or other financial hardship. Travis was feeling good about the plan until his phone rang at 9:30 p.m. It was Mrs. Halbert, and she sounded upset. "Travis, I need to see you. Something's happened." They met again at the Denny's, but this time, Mrs. Halberton looked agitated rather than tired. "My manager pulled me aside tonight," she said, without preamble. "Someone posted a video on TikTok of you talking to me at my register yesterday. It's gone viral. Over 2 million views already." Travis felt his stomach drop. "What kind of video?" "Nothing inappropriate. Just you and me talking. But people are speculating about why you were there, what we were discussing. The comments are, well, some of them are very kind, but others are making assumptions about my financial situation, my family. It's embarrassing. Mrs. H, I'm so sorry. I had no idea anyone was recording. That's not the worst part." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "My manager, Dennis Kowalski, called me into his office. He said that while the attention might be good for the store, he's concerned about unauthorized publicity and employees using their positions to solicit celebrity assistance. He thinks you planned this?" He didn't say that directly, but the implication was clear. He said he's going to have to monitor the situation and that any further incident could result in disciplinary action. Travis felt anger flare in his chest. "He threatened your job?" "Not in so many words, but yes, essentially. That's ridiculous. You didn't do anything wrong." "Travis, I need this job. The health insurance alone is worth $800 a month. I can't afford to lose it, especially not now with Gerald's care costs." Travis was quiet for a moment, thinking. The viral video complicated things, but it might also present an opportunity. "Mrs. H, What if we accelerated our timeline? What if we launched the Teachers Legacy Support Fund publicly tomorrow and announced you as our first consultant? You could give your notice at Walmart before Dennis has a chance to cause more problems. But what if people think I'm taking advantage of our connection? What if they think I manipulated this situation? Then we'll prove them wrong. We'll show them that this is about honoring teachers, not exploiting relationship. We'll make the fund so legitimate and so helpful to other educators that no one will question your involvement. Mrs. Halberton stared out the window of the parking lot, where a few late-night diners were coming and going. 37 years of teaching, and I never imagined I'd be in this situation, having to choose between my pride and my husband's care. You're not choosing between anything. We're creating a third option. She turned back to him with a small smile. You really did listen in my class, didn't you? I always taught you kids to look for creative solutions when the obvious choices weren't good enough. Best lesson you ever taught me. All right, she said, straightening her shoulder in a gesture Travis remembered from high school. Let's do this thing. But Travis, we do it right. No shortcuts, no favoritism. If we're going to help teachers, we help them all fairly. Wouldn't have it any other way. As they shook hands across the Denny's table, neither of them realized that the TikTok video was still gaining momentum. By morning, it would have 15 million views and would catch the attention of news outlets across the country. The story of Travis Kelce and his high school teacher was about to become much bigger than either of them had anticipated. By Thursday morning, the story had exploded beyond anything Travis could have imagined. The original TikTok video had been shared by major news outlets, celebrities, and social media influencers. Someone teachers deserve more was trending nationally, and Travis's phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m. The video itself was innocuous, just a few seconds of Travis talking quietly with Mrs. Halberton at her register, both of them clearly surprised to see each other. But the caption had set the internet on fire. NFL superstar Travis Kelce runs into his old high school teacher working at Walmart. You can see the shock on his face when he realizes who she is. Teachers really don't get paid enough if this is where they end up. The comments section had become a battlefield. Some people praised Travis for treating his former teacher with obvious respect and kindness. Others criticized a system that forced dedicated educators into retail jobs after retirement. But there was also a disturbing undercurrent of people making assumptions about Mrs. Halberton's situation, her family, and her financial decision. Travis was in his kitchen, trying to eat breakfast while juggling calls from his agent, his publicist, and 3 different news producers when Mrs. Halberton called. "Travis, have you seen the news?" "Which news?" he asked, putting her on speaker while he scrolled through his phone. "There are about 40 different stories running right now. Channel 9 just ran a segment called From Classroom to Cash Register, the hidden crisis facing America's retired teacher. They used my name, Travis. They showed a picture of our high school yearbook and everything." Travis stopped scrolling. "Without your permission? It's public information, apparently. They also somehow found out about Gerald's stroke and the medical bill. They're calling it a heartbreaking example of how our education system fails those who dedicated their lives to." "Mrs. H, I'm so sorry. This isn't what I wanted to happen. I know that. But Travis, there's something else. I got called into work early this morning. Dennis wants to see me at 10 a.m. Travis checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. "I'm coming with you." "You can't do that. It'll just make things worse." "Mrs. H, trust me on this. I think it's time we got ahead of this story instead of reacting to it." At 9:50 a.m., Travis walked into the Walmart customer service area wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, his chief's cap pulled low. He asked to speak with Dennis Kowalski and was directed to a small office behind the pharmacy. Dennis was a thin man in his mid-30s with nervous energy and the demeanor of someone who'd been dealing with corporate phone calls all morning. He looked up when Travis knocked on his open door. "Mr. Kelce? What can I do for you?" "I'm here about Mrs. Halberton. I understand you wanted to meet with her this morning?" Dennis's eyes darted toward the main store area. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is really an internal personnel matter." "Actually, it's not." Travis sat down without being invited. "See, Mrs. Halberton and I were discussing a business proposition the other day, a consulting opportunity that I think you'll find very interesting." Before Dennis could respond, Mrs. Halberton appeared in the doorway. She looked nervous but determined. "Dennis, I'm here for our meeting. Please, sit down, Mrs. Halberton." Dennis gestured to the other chair, clearly flustered by Travis's presence. "Mr. Kelce was just telling me about some kind of business proposition? Travis pulled out a formal letter that his lawyer had prepared that morning. Mrs. Halberton has been offered a position as educational consultant for the Teachers Legacy Support Fund, a new nonprofit organization focused on supporting retired educators. The position pays $75,000 annually, plus full health benefit. Dennis blinked rapidly. "I'm sorry, what?" Mrs. Halberton looked at Travis in surprise. They'd discussed the consultant role, but not the specific salary or benefits package. "Mrs. Halberton will be helping us identify and assist retired teachers facing financial hardship due to medical expenses or other unforeseen circumstances." Travis continued smoothly. "It's important work, and we need someone with her experience and integrity to lead the effort." "So she's quitting?" Dennis asked. "If she chooses to accept the position, yes. But Mr. Kowalski, I want you to know that Mrs. Halberton has been an exemplary employee. Any suggestion that she's somehow exploited her position or behaved inappropriately would be completely unfounded." The implied warning in Travis's voice was subtle but unmistakable. Dennis nodded quickly. "Of course, absolutely. Mrs. Halberton has been nothing but professional. We'd hate to lose her, naturally, but we certainly understand that this is an incredible opportunity." Mrs. Halberton found her voice. "I'd like to give 2 weeks' notice, if that's acceptable." "Actually," Travis interjected, "we'd prefer if Mrs. Halberton could start immediately. We're prepared to compensate Walmart for any inconvenience caused by the shortened notice period." Dennis looked like he was trying to process too much information at once. Yes, I think we can work something out." 30 minutes later, Travis and Mrs. Halberton were sitting in his truck in the Walmart parking lot. $75,000? She asked. "Travis, that's more than I made as a teacher. It's what the position is worth." "And Mrs. H, I meant what I said in there. This isn't charity disguised a job. I really do need someone to help me figure out how to do this right. What if I'm not qualified? I've never run a nonprofit or evaluated grant applications. You're qualified to know what teachers need. That's what matters most." Mrs. Halberton was quiet for a moment. "The health insurance? Better than what Walmart offers. Full coverage for you and Gerald." She nodded slowly. "Then I accept. But Travis, we do this professionally. No special treatment because we know each other. If I think an application deserves funding, we fund it. If I think it doesn't, we don't. Agreed?" "Agreed." That afternoon, Travis held an impromptu press conference in the parking lot of Mrs. Halberton's former high school. Local news crews had been following the story all day, and he figured it was better to control the narrative than let speculation run wild. "I want to address the video that's been circulating," he began, standing in front of a small group of reporters. "Mrs. Halberton was my 10th grade history teacher, and she had a profound impact on my life. When I ran into her unexpectedly, it reminded me that we don't do enough to support the educators who shape our community." A reporter raised her hand. "Is it true that you're paying her medical bills?" "I'm not paying anyone's medical bills directly, but I am launching the Teachers Legacy Support Fund, which will provide assistance to retired educators facing financial hardship. Mrs. Halberton has agreed to serve as our educational consultant, helping us identify teachers who need support and ensuring that our assistance reaches the people who need it most." "How much funding are you providing for this initiative?" "We're starting with $500,000, but we hope to raise additional funds from other donors who believe in supporting our teachers." After the press conference, Travis and Mrs. Halberton drove to the long-term care facility where her husband Gerald was being treated. Travis had never met Mr. Halberton, but Mrs. Halberton had talked about him often during their high school conversation, how he'd supported her teaching career, how they'd planned to travel together after retirement. Gerald was sitting in a wheelchair by his window when they arrived. The stroke had affected his speech and mobility, but his eyes were alert and warm. He saw his wife. "Gerald, I want you to meet someone," Mrs. Halberton said gently. "This is Travis Kelce. He was one of my students." Gerald's eyes moved to Travis, and he managed a slight smile. Travis pulled up a chair beside him. "Mr. Halberton, your wife changed my life. She saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. I just wanted you to know that I'm going to make sure she's taken care of, the same way she took care of so many of us." Gerald reached out with his good hand and grasped Travis's arm. He couldn't speak clearly, but his message was unmistakable. "Thank you." As they left the facility that evening, Mrs. Halberton wiped tears from her eyes. "You know, I never expected my retirement to look like this, but maybe this is better than travel and leisure time. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Helping other teachers, helping people, period. Gerald always said that teaching was really about helping people reach their potential. Maybe I'm not done teaching yet. Travis smiled. I hope not, because there are a lot of teachers out there who could use someone like you in their corner. What neither of them knew was that the press conference had been broadcast nationally, and the Teachers Legacy Support Fund website had crashed from the volume of traffic. Donations were pouring in from across the country, and applications for assistance were arriving faster than they could process them. The movement they'd started was about to become much bigger than either of them had imagined. 2 weeks after the press conference, the Teachers Legacy Support Fund had raised over $2.3 million from donors across the country. The small office Travis had rented in downtown Kansas City was bustling with activity as Mrs. Halberton worked with a team of volunteers to process applications from retired teachers seeking assistance. The response had been overwhelming. Teachers from all 50 states had submitted applications, sharing stories of medical debt, inadequate pensions, and the financial struggles that had forced many back into low-paying jobs after retirement. Each application that crossed Mrs. Halberton's desk reinforced her belief that they were addressing a crisis that had been hidden in plain sight for years. "Travis, you need to see this," Mrs. Halberton said, looking up from her computer as he entered the office that Tuesday morning. "We've received over 2,800 applications in 2 weeks. The need is far greater than we initially estimated." Travis pulled up a chair beside her desk. "What's the average amount people are requesting?" "About $35,000 per applicant, most of it for medical expenses. But we're also seeing requests for basic living costs, housing assistance, and prescription drug coverage." She gestured to a stack of printed applications. "Travis, these are people who dedicated their lives to education, and they're choosing between medication and groceries. How many can we help with current funding? At our initial budget, maybe 60 families. But Travis, there's something else. Local news stations in other cities have started covering our story, and they're finding teachers in similar situations everywhere. This isn't just a Kansas City problem, it's national." Travis nodded thoughtfully. "What do you recommend?" "We need to be strategic. Help as many as we can immediately, but also use this momentum to push for systemic change. Band-aid solutions won't fix the underlying problems with teacher pensions and health care." Before Travis could respond, his phone buzzed with a call from Rachel Martinez, his publicist. "Travis, we have a situation," Rachel said without preamble. "Good Morning America wants to do a feature story on the fund. They want to interview you and Mrs. Halberton, and they're asking to follow up with some of the teachers you've helped. That sounds like good publicity." "It would be, except they're also investigating the fund's finance. They want to know exactly how much money you've personally contributed versus what's come from other donors." Travis frowned. "Why does that matter?" "Because some people are questioning whether this is a legitimate charity or a publicity stunt. There's a blogger named Marcus Fleming who's been posting articles suggesting that you're using teacher poverty for social media content. That's ridiculous. I know that, but perception matters. He's gained traction because the fund was created so quickly after the viral video. He's implying that you saw an opportunity for positive press and jumped on it." Travis felt anger rising in his chest, but Mrs. Halberton put a calming hand on his arm. "Travis, put the call on speaker," she said quietly. "Rachel, you're on speaker with Mrs. Halberton." "Hi, Mrs. Halberton. I'm sorry you're having to deal with this scrutiny." "Don't apologize," Mrs. Halberton replied firmly. "I've been dealing with skeptical administrators and budget committees for 37 years. What exactly is this blogger claiming?" "He's suggesting that the fund is essentially Travis's personal charity, disguised as a grassroots movement. He's questioning why Travis happened to be at that particular Walmart, implying that the meeting was staged for social media content." Mrs. Halberton laughed. Actually laughed. "Young lady, I can assure you that no one stages a publicity stunt that involves working the evening shift at Walmart for 4 months. I have the pay stubs to prove it." The blogger is also questioning whether retired teachers really need this level of assistance, suggesting that anyone who worked for 30 years should have adequate saving. "Then Mr. Fleming has never been married to someone who had a massive stroke," Mrs. Halberton said, her voice taking on the authority she'd once used to quiet unruly classrooms. "He's never watched $150,000 in lifetime savings disappear in 6 months of medical bills. He's never had to choose between paying for physical therapy and paying the mortgage. Travis felt a surge of pride listening to his former teacher defend their work. "Mrs. Halberton," Rachel continued, "would you be willing to do the Good Morning America interview? Your perspective might be exactly what we need to counter these criticisms." "Absolutely, but I want to bring some of our application recipients with me. Let people hear directly from teachers who've been helped, not just from us." After ending the call, Travis and Mrs. Halberton spent the rest of the morning reviewing applications and selecting families to feature in their media response. They chose carefully teachers from different states, different subject areas, different circumstances that had led to their financial struggle. There was Maria Santos, a retired elementary school teacher from Phoenix, whose husband's cancer treatment had bankrupted them despite insurance coverage. The fund had helped pay for his experimental treatment, and he was now in remission. Robert Chen, a former high school math teacher from Detroit, had been working as a night security guard to pay for his wife's Alzheimer's care. The fund had covered 3 months of memory care facility costs, allowing him to spend his wife's remaining time with her instead of working multiple jobs. And Sarah Williams, a retired art teacher from rural Mississippi, had been sleeping in her car after losing her home to medical debt from her own emergency surgery. The fund had helped her secure stable housing and get back on her feet. "These are the stories that matter," Mrs. Halberton said as they prepared for the television interview. "Not whether you and I planned our encounter at Walmart, but whether we're actually helping people." The Good Morning America segment aired the following Monday and reached over 4 million viewers. Mrs. Halberton was poised and articulate, sharing specific examples of how the fund had helped teachers while acknowledging the broader systemic issue that needed to be addressed. "This fund is a start, not a solution," she told the interviewer. "We're helping individual families in crisis, but we also need to advocate for better teacher pension, affordable health care, and recognition that educators are essential workers who deserve security in retirement." See, Travis was impressed by how effectively she'd pivoted the conversation from charity to advocacy, from individual assistance to systemic reform. The response to the interview was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Donations increased by 300% in the following week, and applications for assistance doubled. But more importantly, education advocacy groups began reaching out to collaborate on policy initiatives. The National Education Association invited Mrs. Halberton to speak at their annual conference. The American Federation of Teachers asked her to join a task force on retirement security. State legislators in Kansas and Missouri introduced bills to improve teacher pension benefits, citing the Teachers Legacy Support Fund as evidence of the need for reform. "We've started something bigger than we intended," Mrs. Halberton observed during one of their weekly planning meetings. "The fund is helping individual teachers, but it's also shining a light on problems that have been ignored for too long." Travis nodded. "So, what's our next step? We keep helping teachers, but we also use our platform to push for changes that will prevent future teachers from ending up in these situations. We've proven there's public support for helping educate. Now we need to channel that support into lasting reform." T2. As they planned their next phase of advocacy work, neither Travis nor Mrs. Halberton could have predicted that their efforts would soon catch the attention of Washington, D.C., and that a simple encounter at a Walmart would eventually influence national education policy. The ripple effects of their work were spreading far beyond what either of them had imagined. When they first sat down in that 6 months after Travis Kelce first walked into that Independence Walmart, the Teachers Legacy Support Fund had become a national phenomenon. The organization had helped over 400 retired teachers across the country, raised $8.7 million in donations, and sparked legislative action in 15 states. But for Travis, the most meaningful moment came on a quiet Thursday evening when he visited Gerald Halberton at the care facility. Mrs. Halberton had asked him to come because Gerald was having one of his better days, and she wanted him to see something special. "Gerald's been working with his speech therapist," Mrs. Halberton explained as they walked down the facility's cheerful hallway. "His progress has been remarkable since we were able to afford the additional therapy session." They found Gerald in the common room, sitting at a small table with a note and pencil. His handwriting was shaky, but he was clearly writing words with intention and focus. "Gerald, Travis is here," Mrs. Halberton said gently. Gerald looked up and smiled, then pointed to his note. In careful, labored handwriting, he had written, "Thank you for giving me my wife back." Travis felt his throat tighten. "Mr. Halberton, Your wife never went anywhere. She was always going to fight for you." Gerald shook his head slowly and pointed to the notebook again. Below his first message, he had written, "Now she fights for others too. Proud of her." Mrs. Halberton wiped away tears. "Travis, when I was working at Walmart, I came home every night exhausted and defeated. I felt like I was failing Gerald because I couldn't give him the care he needed. Now, I wake up every morning knowing that I'm making a difference for families like ours." As they sat with Gerald, Mrs. Halberton shared updates about the fund's latest developments. They had partnered with major teacher unions to create a nationwide database of retired educators needing assistance. They had worked with policymakers to introduce the Teacher Retirement Security Act in Congress. And they had inspired similar funds in other professions. Police officers, firefighters, and social workers had all started their own support networks, modeled after what Travis and Mrs. Halberton had created. "The most important thing," Mrs. Halberton said, "is that we've changed the conversation. People are finally talking about how we treat the profession, who dedicate their lives to serving others." The next morning, Travis received a call that would mark another milestone in their journey. "Travis, this is Senator Elizabeth Warren's office," the voice said. "The senator would like to invite you and Mrs. Halberton to Washington next week. She's introducing the Teacher Retirement Security Act to the full Senate, and she'd like you both to be there for the announcement." 2 days later, Travis and Mrs. Halberton found themselves in a Senate conference room surrounded by legislators, education advocates, and retired teachers from across the country. Senator Warren stood at the podium, gesturing toward Travis and Mrs. Halberton in the front row. "The Teachers Legacy Support Fund has done more than help individual families. It has shown us that America's retired teachers are facing a crisis that demands immediate action." She outlined the bill's provision: increased federal funding for teacher pension systems, expanded health care benefits for retired educators, and emergency assistance programs for teachers facing medical debt. This legislation exists because Travis Kelce and Marjorie Halberton refused to accept that a career dedicated to education should end in financial hardship, Senator Warren continued. "They showed us that when we take care of our teacher can take care of others." After the announcement, reporters surrounded Travis and Mrs. Halberton for interview. But the question that stuck with Travis came from a young journalist who asked, "Mr. Kelce, when you walked into that Walmart 6 months ago, did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Travis looked at Mrs. Halberton, who was fielding questions from education reporters with the same patience and insight she'd once shown in room 237. "Honestly, no," Travis replied. "I just saw someone who had changed my life, and I wanted to help her the way she had helped me. But Mrs. Halberton taught me that the best solutions don't just solve one problem. They create opportunities to solve many problems. What's next for the fund? We keep growing, we keep helping teachers, and we keep pushing for systemic changes that ensure no educator has to choose between retirement security and basic dignity." That evening, Travis and Mrs. Halberton had dinner at a small restaurant near Capitol Hill. As they reviewed the day's events, Mrs. Halberton pulled out her phone to show Travis something. "I got a message today from Sarah Chen," she said, referring to a former student who had been in her class the same year as Travis. "She's now a teacher herself, working in inner-city Detroit. She said she heard about our fund and wanted me to know that it's inspired her to stay in education despite the challenges." She scrolled to another message. "And this is from Michael Rodriguez. You remember him, the student who always struggled with history but worked harder than anyone else. He's a principal now in Los Angeles. He said seeing what we've accomplished has motivated him to create his own support network for teachers in his district." Travis smiled. The ripple effect continued. "It does. But Travis, I want you to know that none of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night at Walmart. Most people would have been polite, maybe promised to keep in touch, and then gone on with their lives. Mrs. H, you taught me that education is about more than just learning facts. It's about learning to see opportunities to make things better. And you taught me that it's never too late to use what you've learned to help others." As they walked back to their hotel that night, passing the illuminated Capitol building where laws were made that would affect millions of Americans, Travis reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been focused on his football career, his celebrity relation, and his post-retirement plan. He never could have imagined that a chance encounter in a suburban Walmart would lead him to Washington, D.C., advocating for legislative changes that would protect retired teachers across the country. But maybe that was the real lesson Mrs. Halberton had taught him all those years ago in high school, that the most important opportunities often come disguised as ordinary moments, and the most meaningful success comes from using your advantages to lift others up. The Teachers' Legacy Support Fund would continue to grow, eventually helping thousands of retired educators and inspiring similar movements in other professions. The legislation Senator Warren had introduced would pass 6 months later, providing federal protections for teacher retirement benefits and health care. But the impact that mattered most to Travis was simpler and more personal. Gerald Halberton was receiving the care he needed. Mrs. Halberton was using her expertise to help others, and teachers across America were being reminded that their contributions mattered, not just to their students, but to society as a whole. As Travis fell asleep in his Washington hotel room that night, his last thought was of room 237 at Cleveland Heights High School, where a dedicated teacher had once told a young football player that his mind was just as powerful as his body. She had been right then, and she was still teaching him now, 30 years later, that the most powerful thing anyone can do is use their gift in service of others. The circle was complete, but the ripples would continue spreading for generations to come.